Let's get started. Maybe some people are still getting up and doing their brushings and starting their computer, or some people may join on the Facebook. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first training workshop of the Youth Think Tank competition of the EAA Flyway. I'm Vivian Fu, the Communication Officer of the EAAFP Secretariat. And I'm also the coordinator of the Youth Think Tank competition. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And before, next slide, please. Before we get started, officially, we want to say, like every time, there are some few notices for you to participate in the webinar. So first of all, during the webinar, it will be helpful to mute your mic during the presentation so that it won't disturb the speakers. Second is after each presentation, we will have Q&A sections. So please type your questions to the speakers in the chat box, and you can find the icon here at the bottom of the Zoom app. And we will collect these questions and deliver to the speakers. We are also recording the live streaming for this webinar and on EAFP Facebook page. So if you do not want to appear on the recording, please switch off your webcam video. And we also want you to help to share this Facebook link to your in your network. And this is today's rundown. After the welcoming remarks from our Chief Executive, I will introduce briefly about migratory water birds and wetlands and EAFP. And then we will have our honorable keynote speakers, Ms. Sara Castro-Hallgren, UN Resident Coordinator System, and Ms. Josefa Tauli from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. We will have the Q&A section after each presentation. So without further ado, I would like to share our the welcoming speech from our Chief Executive, Mr. Doug Watkins, to kickstart this webinar. So Sawam, our IT technician today, please help to share the video. It's not showing the audio. Maybe you have to share it again. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Doug Watkins, the Chief Executive of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Secretariat. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, the young generation, who are interested in or involved in nature conservation, on joining our first workshop of Youth Think Tank competition for the EAA Flyway. In recent years, we've witnessed the power of youth to call for actions to tackle environmental issues. This week, there is an event that grabs the whole world's attention, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, COP26. Many of you might still remember how a Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, campaigned against climate change, awakening decision makers that youth could help make a difference in the world and their voice should be heard and taken into account. We believe the youth should also take a key role in nature conservation, for you are energetic, adaptive and innovative. In addition, as the future of the world will be led by your generation, youth should be involved and engaged in conservation, from the implementation of actions to decision-making processes. Youth are important stakeholders, and we believe youth can be a driving force for a better world. Last year, the EAFP Secretariat and Youth Engaged in Wetlands organised the first ever Flyway Youth Forum, engaging over 100 young people, experts, conservationists and government representatives to share their thoughts on conservation of migratory water birds and wetlands. A youth declaration was announced at the end of the forum. We saw how eager young people are to understand more and contribute more to protect nature. To continue the momentum of the 2020 Flyway Youth Forum, we want to provide opportunities for young people to take action. Especially during the COVID pandemic period, travel restrictions make us pay more attention to local issues and reflect on our relationship with nature. Therefore, the EAFP Secretariat is holding hands with partners and youth groups to organise the first Youth Think Tank competition for the EAA Flyway, to inspire innovative ideas and encourage conservation actions by youth for migratory water birds, their habitats, and local communities that rely on wetlands. Today and tomorrow, we are holding the very first workshop for the Youth Think Tank competition. Our Secretariat has invited valuable and experienced trainers and speakers in the environmental and nature conservation fields. I hope all of you will gain invaluable insights and be encouraged to lead more youth activities to conserve wetlands and migratory water birds. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to our supporting organisations, UNOSD, Global Youth Biodiversity Network, BirdLife International, Green Environment Youth Korea, WWF Hong Kong One Planet Youth Program, and Nusa Biodiversitas Indonesia. We wish you all a wonderful experience with the first workshop for Youth Think Tank competition for the EAA Flyway. Thank you.
Great. So next, I think we are going to share the to tell you more about the background about the EAFP and this think tank competition, which is focusing on migratory water birds and wetlands. As for some of you may not have such background, so I'm going to do a very brief introduction about what we are focusing on. So I think you can see my screen now. Is it okay? Right. So yeah, let me know if you can see only the presenters the talker slide, or I have to change. Okay. Is it working well? Okay, so let me get
We don't see it full screen presence, I think.
Okay. I think I have to swap. Is it okay now? Okay, thank you. So first of all, for some of you who may not know what are water birds, so in general, they are species of water birds, species of birds that are ecologically dependent on the wetlands. Next, and you may ask what are migratory water birds? So there are ecological definition in general that's for water birds which whole or part of their population of that species may travel between the breeding and non-breeding grounds in a regular and seasonal manner in a predictable timing. So usually they were traveling every 2 times every year, and normally they are traveling between the north and south. So this is a diagram about how they are traveling every year between the north, and which are usually their breeding ground, and to the south to their non-breeding ground. Here is the map of the 9 major flyways of the world. And in the middle, you can see the East Asian Australasian Flyway, which stretches from the Russian Far East and the Alaska in USA, all the way through Mongolia, China, Japan, DPR Korea, Euro Korea, Southeast Asia, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. And this is where our focus of the EAA Flyway is. And we are now in the middle of the flyway in South Korea, where the Secretariat of the EAFP Basin, and where I'm now. And you can see there are overlapping of some of the flyways in this map. To give you more about the situation of the EAA Flyway, we have over 50 million of migratory water birds of over 210 species using this flyway. And in this graph, you can see we have over 36 globally threatened and 19 near-threatened. And in this near-threatened species in our flyway, which is, according to this graph, it is not the most favorable flyway to the migratory water birds. As comparing to the other flyways, it has the highest in proportion of the globally threatened and near-threatened species. So what are the things, the threats that are making these our flyway not so favorable to our migratory water birds? there are lots of threats that they have to face along their migration routes, including habitat loss, as you can see here, illegal hunting. This grassland over here is not something natural. These are covered by the mud flats in the coastal area, are covered by the invasive species. And we have human disturbance in the wetlands that are also imposing or threatening the migratory water birds. Because many migratory water birds, all the migratory water birds, they have to rely on the wetlands. So when we talk about conserving migratory water birds, we also talk about the conservation of the wetlands. And migratory water birds, they are excellent indicator of the health of the wetlands ecosystems. And in these pictures, you can see there are actually a lot of ecological services provided by the wetlands. And these are not only favorable or important for the migratory water birds, but also to human beings. So like wetlands, they are also helping to control floods and protected us from the natural disaster. They are also as a water supply source for human and biodiversity. They also absorb and remove pollutants in the through the wetlands systems. The wetlands are excellent and now known as one of the most important carbon storage to mitigate climate change. Overall, 1 billion people makes a living from the wetlands, and we also have most of our food resources coming out from the wetlands. And of course, we also go to wetland for recreations. So now let's zoom out a little bit about to the regional scales for protecting the migratory water birds. So in this map, you can see like how we are putting the effort to maintain the ecosystem of wetlands in the regional scale. But just looking at one species for protecting the Far Eastern curlew, we have like these many of countries to protect just one species, and therefore we have to have the international collaboration. And that was why we have the EAAFP, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, established in 2006, which is a network of partners within the East Asian Australasian Flyway aiming to protect migratory water birds, the habitats and the livelihoods of people depending on these wetlands. Until now, we have 39 partners in the EAFP, including 18 government partners out of the 22 countries in our flyway. We also have 6 intergovernmental organizations, including the Ramsar Convention, as I mentioned about the importance of wetlands. So Ramsar Convention is the intergovernmental organization's legal binding convention for aiming for wetlands conservation. We also have 13 international NGOs as our partners, 1 international organizations, IUCN, and a private sector. So this is quite a unique partnership because we cater all the sectors, the government sector, the NGO sector, and the private sectors. As mentioned, to effectively protect and sustain the importance of the important wetlands and make sure that these wetlands are sustainably managed, the EAFP established a Flyway Site Network. And out of the over 1,000 identified important sites for migratory water birds, we have designated 149 Flyway Network sites, which meets the criteria as a Ramsar sites and also designated by the government partners. Apart from our 39 partners in EAFP, we also work with a range of different stakeholders. So including government focal points, INGOs, of course, and site managers who are protecting and managing all the important wetlands identified as a Flyway Network sites. We also work with private companies, researchers and experts on the research on the wetlands and migratory water birds. We also work with school teachers, educators, local communities, citizens, media, and a wider range of stakeholders like artists and musicians. And of course, we want to work with you, the young people. So for the next, as we know, working on conservation is not only a matter to the local people, local issues, but for the effective management and protection of the wetlands, it comes with the policies. So next, we are going to have invite two keynote speakers to share about the global agendas about and how we can how it links to international, regional, and local levels for the implementation of effective protection of these the wetlands and the protection of migratory water birds and for biodiversity in general, and how young people can be engaged. So first of all, I would like to invite our first speakers, Ms. Sara Castro-Hallgren, economist of the UN Resident Coordinator Systems. Sara is currently working under the UN Resident Coordinator System as the economist coordinating the SDG implementation in Paraguay. She started her UN career in 2009, and she was previously based in the ROK and actually in Songdo as well, UN and working for the UNDESA's projects offices, including UNOSD, focusing on policy research, capacity building, and strategy partnerships for SDG implementation and public governance in the member states. Sara's expertise is in public policies and capacity development of public institutions, especially for SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production patterns in Asia Pacific countries. She is also focuses on the behavioral science research and initiated the Behavioral Insights Research Committee under the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, serving as a co-chair. So now I would like to pass on the time to Sara for her presentation. Sara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so I'll just get started here. As Vivian mentioned, yes, my specialty and focus is on policy implementation for the Sustainable Development Goals, and previously working with UNOSD, who invited me, since most of the activities that we did with youth, we would focus on the SDGs as well. And so basically, in the case of this event, I think a lot of you probably know about the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you raise your hands, all the participants that we have? Can you raise your hands if you know the Sustainable Development Goals or if you've heard about them before? Great. I see most of you have, so that's wonderful. So I'll just focus on the basics of sustainability, SDGs, and global governance, and basically where we are today. How many of you know about this? This is what we call biocapacity, and so it looks at the green, which are the countries that are able, they're doing well, we could say, relatively environmentally, because they're able to share their natural resources with the world. They export their natural resources and rely on that for their economies. And so these countries are consuming less, we could say, than what they're producing in terms of environmental impact currently. But the countries that are in red are the ones that are exceeding their natural resource boundaries. So those countries in red are kind of the ones that we can see today, and this number is growing because some countries like Brazil and others like Australia and many others don't change the policies quickly enough. So that means that at the end of the day, they start to go into the red zone as well. So as our populations grow and have grown over the last especially 60 years, after what we have, it's called the Great Acceleration, we can see that the world has become more red. We're exceeding what our planet can offer. And so that has led us into what many call the Anthropocene era. And so this is our new geological era. A lot of you may remember this, like if you in school, you studied about the dinosaurs and these different periods, Earth's geological periods. So we've had this long running history of Earth, right? And so now today we are in this top part where humans came about, really recent, and this is our era now, where we've made enough of a geological footprint with plastics, for example, and others that are going to become part of the Earth record. And so that's our footprint. That's our legacy for now. And climate change, of course. So that's the Anthropocene era that we're in right now, human impact. And so when I mentioned the Great Acceleration, it's really when this period started of human planetary impact. This is a graph that's from the key paper that tracks this planetary impact. And so how do we know that we're not doing such a great job with the Earth? We see on the right side, it's very difficult to see, but you'll get the PowerPoint after as well. This is what we see, like terrestrial biosphere degradation, domesticated land impact, tropical forest loss, aquaculture, ocean acidification, all of these things, they also have an impact on migratory birds and basically species conservation. So all of these impacts, the negative impacts have been exceeding, and that's the exceeding or the increase, the acceleration in the negative impacts from all of these patterns is what we call the Great Acceleration. So the Great Acceleration really started, and if you put a population graph against this, it goes together. You can see the patterns. As population has increased, so too has all of these negative impacts. And that's again because of the red parts we see on the planet that we need to consume a lot of resources, and that has negative planetary impacts. So these are the patterns that we follow to track the planetary impacts and show us that we're accelerating the negative impacts at an unsustainable rate since the 1950s. So this is what I mentioned, this population and consumption link. Again, you can see here that after the year 1950 is when we had this acceleration start on both the population side and if you look at it by age groups. And so what's happening is that this will continue to increase. So when we talk about sustainable development, the key thing is to look at future generations, right? And so future generations, the legacy is not looking so good, and I think we all know that, but it's really linked to population growth as well. In global governance, so the agreements that as the United Nations and country representatives, as an intergovernmental organization, there have been a lot of different key points in the history, especially recently in the last 50 years. And so if we look at this, we knew about the challenges of population growth and human planetary impact. We knew about that, I think some of you may have heard about Thomas Malthus, and so those kind of warnings that were sent to us, and we planned for that with technological breakthroughs. But in global agreements and in global governance, we have been acknowledging the impact of human environment and the importance of preserving the planet for future generations, really since 1972, where this landmark conference in Stockholm happened, that will be happening again soon. So this conference in 1972 remarked, the importance of preserving the planet for future generations. And then there was another key publication that I encourage a lot of you to read that's called The Limits to Growth. And this was where a lot of the systems thinking science emerged, what was called the World 3 model. And so this model, which is part of those planetary impact patterns that we see today, showed us that human consumption and population growth and the lifestyles and all of these things are interlinked with the planet because of this systems thinking. We live in an interconnected system. So we had to moderate the demand for children, it said at that time, at this time of the report in 1972, the limits to growth, because population growth rates were linked and are linked to this. And so again, that was acknowledged in 1987, that consumption was a challenge, and so having to balance these issues. And then we had the publication of this key report, which I still use today in my job all the time, because when you look back at this, it's called Our Common Future. It was the outcome of this 1987 conference. And to this day, a lot of it has not been achieved. So it's kind of like our guiding book for how things should be done, but it hasn't been implemented fully yet. So it's really important to always go back and look at that publication. It's our reference point, and it shows us that even then we knew what had to change, but still today we're not changing a lot of those things. So we continued, and in that report, the key contribution from this report, it's called the Brundtland Commission's report as well. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway at the time before, and then she was deputed to lead this commission. And so they met together with many different scientists and published this and defined what we know as sustainable development today in our common future. And it showed us, well, sustainable development really means relying on 3 pillars. So the 3 pillars are what we know, right? Economic, social, environmental. So we all want to achieve middle income consumption status, we can say. That's what many deserve, right? We want to pull people out of extreme poverty, reduce the social impacts, but this has consequential environmental impacts. So we want to balance all 3 of those. That was the idea that came out of this fundamental report in 1987. But we continued then because, you know, like I said, if you look back, the report still hasn't been fully implemented. So we met at 1992, which was called Rio Conference. And so this Agenda 21 was fomented and agreed by the United Nations, or all the governments. They adopted Agenda 21 and acknowledged that there is major deterioration of the global environment happening, and this has to do with how we consume and produce, how we run our economies, basically. 10 years later, you had another conference, the landmark conference, and then other key global agreements that happened. And then 10 years later, you had Rio Plus 20, where the future we want was adopted. And so the sustainable development goals started to be shaped. So countries agreed what was there before, which was the Millennium Development Goals. That was the first agenda where it was goal oriented, and countries agreed that wasn't enough. It was a bit top down, and it didn't comprehensively look at everything that we needed to achieve. So then in 2015, countries adopted this framework. This framework acknowledged that everything, yes, it's interdependent, it is part of the system, it's interconnected. If you invest in one, you can get 3 free. So that's what I always tell governments. If you invest in SDG 10, for example, to reduce inequality, or SDG 12, you can achieve impacts across the entire agenda. So we have less than 10 years remaining now, and this is supposed to be the decade of action, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, across the globe, developed and developing countries have seen setbacks on this. So it more than ever, I think if there's one key message that I offer today, we have to focus on environment. Because of the challenges, the socioeconomic challenges, that automatically translates to stronger pressures on the environment, because the environment is our, we can say that's where we get our resources, right, to sustain ourselves. So it's more than ever important that we learn to balance this relationship with the planet. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Inside of them, each one has a target that is related to different agreements that have been implemented through diplomacy. So SDG 5, SDG 6, each one of them has a type of global agreement that underpins the goal. I think you'll know that the Convention on Biodiversity is part of SDG 15 and 14, and then 13 is where you'll find the Paris Agreement. So climate change, the Paris Agreement is part of achieving SDG 13. But really, as a whole, we have 232 indicators or ways that we look at measuring the goals and progress on each one of them. And that means data and learning how, basically a dashboard of how the environment is improving or not, for example. The key thing is that I mentioned in that report in 1997, the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future, it was 3 pillars. But then with the SDGs, we agreed it has to be more, because issues like conflict, and this is all has to do with the partnership as well. So those 2 pillars of peace and partnership were also added. And that means that we have 5 pillars of how we define sustainable development today. So planet, prosperity, the people, of course, the social side, but then also the peace and the diplomacy, the partnership, and then working together with private sector too, for example, on financing, and many others. So just like the way that the Flyway partnerships are crafted, that's the same idea. We need to work together. Let's see. And so what do we talk about? Like, so one of the things that we talk about when we're looking at the SDGs and generally what they aim to achieve is changing what I mentioned, the economies, the way that we function, to make sure that it's less linear, this take, make, waste model of resource extraction to substantiate our consumption and growth and progress. But then it's also the circular side as well, shifting to this circular way of an economic model, we could say, or a subsistence or survival model, where we're more circular in every sense of the word. And so in terms of our consumption and production, everything, there's no wasted resource. That's kind of the mentality. So when we take something, a resource, we make sure that it stays in this cycle and that we can get as many benefits as possible. You can do that through economic clustering, through working together more. So there's many different types of solutions, but it requires a lot of different policies, including working on preserving wetlands. And so a key message that I wanted to share is that when we think about biodiversity protection, it's a challenge because of the way that the economies are shaped today on our planet. So does anybody know, from the ones participating, how we calculate GDP? So when we talk about GDP, this is a great book as well that I'm sharing here. So if you have time, I encourage you to read this book. Oh, I see. The countries shaded in white in the picture meant that there's no data, not enough data on those countries. Does anybody know? So GDP, when we talk about gross domestic product, so that key number that economies rely on to say, and investors in the private sector and many partners rely on to see, is a country doing well or not? That's sort of our temperature gauge that is used a lot of the time, right? That's the default way that we think. That's really relying on consuming natural resources and just consuming in general that has an impact on the planet. So whether it's you're buying palm oil, you're buying plastic, you're buying any of these things, it has an impact on the planet. But that's how we calculate GDP. It's this consumption side plus investment. And then we have the government spending, which is also going somewhere, and you have to ask yourself, and then exports minus imports. And so you have to ask yourself for each economy, how much of these things are improving the environment and how much is not? So how much is consumer spending, including your own, improving the environment or not? How much are the investments going into green funds, or maybe something linked to conservation? Is the government spending going somewhere where we want it to go to achieve the SDGs or to improve climate change? Our country's exports, is it palm oil that's based on deforestation, for example? Is it, and the same with imports. Am I importing into the European Union illegally deforested wood from the Amazon or from Indonesia that was deforested to plant palm oil? So then there's no more biodiversity left. So all of those things that goes into calculating GDP. And so we don't have a measure of something called green GDP. That was attempted once, but it hasn't worked out. So we don't have a way to measure how much of the economy is improving the environment or not. So if any of you is interested in this type of research or career, I really encourage you to look into this more. Because we really need to look at this data and track the environmental impact, especially on conservation efforts. Another key message that I want to share with you is that behavior. So when I mentioned, what you buy or what your families buy or what your friends buy or anyone in your community, that has to do, a lot of the times we want to do better for the planet, but we have what's called an intention action gap. So when it comes down to it, we can't change our behavior fast enough because we want to do it, but then when it comes down to it, we say, oh, then, it's maybe too expensive, or maybe it's too difficult to recycle this, or it's too difficult to not buy plastic. It's really difficult, in a developing country. Sometimes you have no choice, like your water, for example, if you want to buy clean water, it may be very difficult where you are to buy something that's better or has less of an environmental footprint. So you have to try harder and in closing this intention action gap. And there's many ways that you can do that. So there's barriers, but these are also solutions. I think one of the most powerful ones of these is that we look to others on how to behave. That's called social cues. And so when we say like be the change, you can be this influencer person, and that also motivates others to change and improve their behavior. It was mentioned like Greta Thunberg, for example, and a lot of other wonderful environmental youth activists that we have. We can all inspire others, and then others rely on those social cues, and then that means that the norm changes in our communities to do better. So like in the country where I'm from, for example, in Central America, originally, I used to go and clean up waste from the beaches, and people would say, you're crazy. Why are you doing this? You're going to get sick. But then there were beach cleanups that started, and many people do the beach cleanups now. So it's not something, it just takes one person basically, and then we can all start to change the norms around things. And that's why behavior change is so important. Another suggestion I had was it's what we call Earth Overshoot Day. This usually happens around August, and this is measured. Basically, it's measuring how much of the resources on the planet have we extracted. And the fact is that we need more than one planet to survive. And if population growth continues at this current rate, we will need 3 planets to survive. The resources of 3 planets, which we don't have. So we need to change the footprint that we have on the Earth. And you can calculate your own footprint and that of others, for example, like in a classroom or anywhere else where you are, if you go to this website, footprintcalculator.org, and it helps you to think about this and then maybe work together to change a bit. And so where are we today? Today, where we talk about the carbon budget and the environmental impact, it was mentioned, I think a lot of us know that right now COP26 is happening in Glasgow. And so we know that with current policies, things may improve if our world leaders and the politicians, local leaders included, can implement the policies. They may improve, but who will this affect? We know that it's going to affect youth more, and then especially our children. So if you see a baby today, that baby is the one that's going to be dealing with way more extreme weather and challenges when it comes to climate change. So it's about the future and looking ahead, and that's makes behavior change hard for many, but we need to understand that we have very little of a carbon budget left over. And at current policies, it's going to be probably 3 degrees of warming, but with some of the agreements that have been reached, maybe 1.7 degrees of warming currently if everything is implemented. And that means devastating impacts for everybody everywhere, developed and developing countries alike. So when we talk about the SDGs, if you want to convince somebody, for example, of the issues like climate change and environmental impacts, the SDGs will be very difficult to achieve if we don't get this under control, if we don't learn to balance the consumption and production patterns that we have with environmental impact. So this is a quick video. It's a longer video, but sometimes when you want someone to understand climate change, it's really hard for them to, if you speak to older generations or skeptics on this, or people in general, they may just not want to hear about it. And so you can show a video if you ever have the chance. And this is a great video that I found that shows what it's really going to look like and what it's like for some around the globe already that are facing the impacts. So it's really here now and it's happening. Some of us may not see it. And so we live like in a more comfortable situation, but it is really happening. And so this is a great video resource that I encourage you to share. Oh, we cannot watch the video now, so let's just skip ahead. Another thing I wanted to mention that I said that we have our colleagues that are going to talk about the CBD, so the Convention on Biological Diversity. This the process started for a great breakthrough new agreement and a lot of other great decisions that can help us move forward on the SDGs as well. And so I mentioned SDG 15, for example, life on land, that is really centrally rooted in this convention. And so this process has started, and so there was a first part, this virtual format that took place a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, and then the second part will take place again next year in China. So I really encourage you to follow the process, and so you can see you can see here at this link as well, because the decisions that are being made here, and then the same here. Actually, in the event here, this one is happening today as well at 11:45. So it's linking COP26, which is happening, and then the COP15, the Convention on Biodiversity. COP26, which I mentioned is happening in Glasgow, you can follow the outcomes of the conference here. So far, the negotiations look like progress has been made, but the challenge is that as I mentioned, there have been global agreements before, and the challenge is that agreements are not implemented fully or they're stalled. So when a leader gets home or when the leader changes and you have new politicians in place or other political challenges, it comes down to this issue of politics. It's really about the politics. So I really wanted to give you this call to action about being the change and really leading to get involved in politics and policy, because at the end of the day, many leaders can agree on the commitments that need to happen, but as I mentioned, these are long-term commitments. These are commitments that take time. They require accountability and especially enforcement at the local level. How are your wetlands being treated? How are your forests being protected? How is ocean quality being protected, or waterways? All of these things, it requires local action and it requires politics and policy. So I really encourage you to get involved as a politician or a member of your party, or at least voting in the elections whenever they happen. And recommending policies as well. Maybe becoming part of a political party in your country and just seeing what's possible for you to do to be a leader and change policy and get more happening in terms of implementation. So yes, you agree things when you go somewhere at a conference, but then when you come home, you actually have to make sure that it gets implemented. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. And I really wish you the best in your careers and in the competition as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. That is a really good presentation, giving us some background about the history of how SDG is developed and explaining especially about the behavioral changes. I love that you mentioned that there can be small changes, and the young people here sitting in this webinar they will be the change for our future. So yeah, that's really important to, and thank you very much for your messages. And yeah, so I now open the floor for the questions. And if you have any questions, you can also, we only have like a small number of people here. So you can raise your hands to, and you can also switch on your webcam and mic and ask questions to Sarah directly. And don't miss the chance. And yeah. Okay. I didn't actually see any questions posed in the chat box, but maybe I can raise one question on behalf of the youth here. Sarah, you mentioned about recommendation for youth to be the change and maybe get engaged in into the politics. So before we get to that chance, or before the youth get into the politics or become politicians, what would you recommend for them to be prepared to get into this path so that they can get more efficacy directly?
Yeah, I think it really has to do with studying what it is that you want to change. So if you see that there's something specifically wrong, like I mentioned, if you see that a specific area, you want to clean up a certain area or make sure that there's an improved action around a certain, it's one tangible issue that you really care about. So I think if you're just passionate about the one issue that you care about, then you can organize and get others involved and see what research and know the evidence of what the policies are around that. Are there policies that maybe already exist but just aren't being implemented? Is there someone specifically in some type of organization or a stakeholder, private sector or public sector that maybe needs to get on board to improve the issue that you care about? And so organize a strategic plan basically around the issue that you care about and the policies you want to change, and then see what politicians there already could support you, or and then know your field, know your area basically. And then we see that today, like in the Philippines and other countries, you see that there's a lot of young inspirational mayors, for example. And so young mayors can make a big difference because they're close to the issues. And so you can see other successful examples around your region of who has become a politician, who has become a leader, basically, whether they're not an elected official, but maybe a different type of leader that's had an impact. And so just try to be the change, so be like them, and then do your own path for your own issue that you're passionate about.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That's a good suggestions. Especially for our think tank competition, we are quite focused on the migratory water birds and wetlands. So this is a good topic to be focused in. And if people are passionate in this topic, that would be good. And yeah, so next, I saw questions from AS. What about those countries not shaded in white? So I think that may be referring to one of your slides earlier, but maybe we can have AS to share your screen, or you can open your mic to elaborate more about your questions. AS, maybe I invite you to unmute yourself if you would like to raise your questions.
From the map, I mentioned it, so that map is here, and you can see it's the same website, but it's what we call the nation's footprint. So that's the footprint of a whole country, basically. So you can see at that link, and the whites means that the country has no data. There's no information.
Okay, thank you for this question, for the answer. And right, okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? And even from our organizing team, the volunteers can also raise questions if you like. Okay. Oh, okay, we got one.
Yeah, I see it. So Miftah, yeah, you don't have to get engaged in politics, but that's what I mean. If you want the agreements that get agreed upon for whether it's biodiversity or climate change or the Ramsar Convention or others to be implemented, then getting involved in policy or getting involved in civil society where you track if the policy is being implemented, that's helpful. And so without getting engaged in politics, you can just go around one issue. So that's something that you're passionate about, as I mentioned, and get others involved and solve the problem. And see, you know, maybe you don't want to do it through politics because it's really challenging. but at the end of the day, that's when I mentioned that it's very important to track whether things are being implemented, maybe from civil society or from an academia side, like a university, but something that holds, shines a light and creates more accountability for better enforcement.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That's a good answer. And okay, and no more questions. Well, if you have more questions later on after digesting the presentation, you can still share with us through email. Maybe we can pass it on to Sarah for the answer to your questions. So I know now, Sarah, at your time is really near the midnight. Thank you very much. And before we say goodbye and good night to Sarah, I would like to invite all of you to to switch on your webcam and do a group photo together. So for all of you with your webcam on, so that we can do a screenshot for snapshot for you. Yay. Wow, nice to see all the young people here joining us. Okay, so maybe I can have Sewon and Hyawin to help to take the screenshot, a cap screen for this. Right, we have 2 pages, so let's say yeah, okay. So 1, 2, 3, Flyway. Is it okay, Sewon? Okay, that's done. Okay, thank you so much again to Sarah for your staying so late to give the presentation to us. And this webinar is on our Facebook, so you can replay it and share with your friends. And thank you so much, Sarah. Oh, okay, sorry. Someone said we want to do it again. So maybe there are some technical issues. So let's do it once more. Sorry about that. Okay. Have your happy face. I will also do this then. All right. Is it all right? Perfect. Okay. So thank you and good night, Sarah.
Bye. Best of luck, everybody. Good luck. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's switch to our next speakers. We have Sefa, and Sefa, let's spotlight to you for you. Okay, as Sarah mentioned that in the Philippines there are lots of like young mayors and leading politicians. So we have Sefa here, also from the Philippines, as one of the leading conservationists for the biodiversity. So let me share a screen. I actually don't need to share a screen. We have Sefa here, and she is correct me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. Ibaloi Kankanai Igorets indigenous youth from the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She is currently representing the indigenous and local youth on the steering committee on the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, the GYBN, the official youth constituency of the UN Convention on Biological Biodiversity, the CBD. Sefa has been advocating for the meaningful and the effective participation of youth and the recognition of indigenous peoples' issues within the biodiversity policy space since 2018. She has actively contributed to the GYBN's policy advocacy work to the CBD meetings, and she has recently just spoken on behalf of GYBN in the CBD COP. And she is participating in the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Safar is a former Indigenous Fellow under the Conservation International's Indigenous Leaders Conservation Fellowship and co-chair of the Youth for Territories of Life, the youth group for the Global ICCA Consortium. Safar is currently a graduate student focusing her research on biocultural diversity conservation in her home region. So now, Safar, over to you. The platform is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vivian. And hi, everyone. Really nice to join you today. I'm Sefa. I'm from the Philippines. Today, I'll be talking about the global biodiversity agenda, what the world is doing to tackle biodiversity loss. It's also a crash course on global policy relating to biodiversity. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a short reflection period. What do you need to live? I'm asking this when you can take some time to think about it. But probably the first few things that have popped into your head are things like food, water, and air. Some of you might have thought of medicine. Some of you might have even gone further to think like a livable climate, for instance, or plants growing around us. Some of you might have also started to think about things like community, like art and music and beauty, right? These are all things that we rely on for a good quality of life. And all of these things, almost every single thing of the things we need to live, rely on biodiversity. Biodiversity is the web of life. It's the diversity of all life on Earth, right? Biodiversity is all the species on our planet and the genetic diversity and the ecosystems also formed by them and their interactions with each other. And biodiversity has been evolving for millions of years to form the diversity of all life on Earth that we see today, right? But not only do we rely on biodiversity for a good quality of life, we also rely very much on cultural diversity. And cultural diversity is, the languages, the worldviews, the knowledge systems, identities, and practices that we as societies use to relate to our environment and to each other. And in the same way that rich biodiversity underpins resilience of the natural system, great cultural diversity also brings resilience to us as societies, right? So just to explain a bit more, biodiversity and cultural diversity are actually very much intertwined. For instance, language is what we use to communicate knowledge that we have about nature. And when we lose languages, we're losing all of this knowledge connected to it, right? And in the same way, when we lose nature, this also tends to mean that we lose certain knowledge systems and worldviews related to it, okay? And we also know that currently we are in an environmental crisis. Recent environmental landmark reports on nature have shown or have found that we are losing biodiversity at rates that are faster than at any time in human history. 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and that we're losing the fabric of life that we very much rely on. We also know that we are losing all that nature that we rely on nature for. Things like regulation of air quality, climate, learning and inspiration, all of these things, as you can see, are in decline, except for a few things. And these are the stuff that we take from nature: energy, food and feed materials. We are taking more and more from these from nature for these at the expense of all of these other contributions. And this is manifesting in as you know, deforestation, in ocean coral bleaching, for instance, wildfires that we have been hearing on the news. And not just, it's not just affecting nature. As we know, we are all in a global pandemic, COVID-19, which is affecting millions of people. And at its root, this pandemic is rooted really in loss of biodiversity and loss of habitats. So we know that more and more energy materials are being supplied to people, but not just that. We also know that the benefits from nature are being very vastly unequally distributed across the world. For instance, we know that richer countries are getting more, while the countries who contribute the least to environmental destruction get the least benefits. We also know, for instance, within a society that the richer people who do contribute more to carbon emissions, for instance, also get more, with the poorer people getting less. So this is a big crisis that we're facing. And it's really not just an environmental crisis. It's a socio-ecological crisis. And we know that our social issues and challenges are very, very much interconnected with the environmental crisis that we're also facing. Okay, so what now? Of course, we need to address the drivers of biodiversity loss. And many of you might already be quite familiar with these. These are things like land use change, exploitation, climate change, for instance, is one of the leading causes of biodiversity loss, pollution, and invasive species. So these are the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. But something that we don't often talk about is that at the root of all of these are values and behaviors of many people which are not really, or in many systems also, that are not very consistent with living in harmony with nature, right? This is of course not applicable to everyone. In fact, for many, for instance, indigenous peoples and local communities, many do live very sustainably and are guardians of biodiversity, but still for a lot of people, especially those in power, values and behaviors are not consistent with what we need to actually live in harmony with nature. And what experts are calling for is that we need actually transformative changes. We need big changes in the economic system, in the technological factors that we have. And we need it very quickly because this is our only shot at actually being able to achieve the goals that we have set up for us to actually address nature loss. Okay, so what has the world been doing to tackle the environmental crisis? It has been quite a while, a few decades already, where the world recognized that we are losing nature and that we need to do something about it. And just like migratory birds, as Vivian mentioned, right? Migratory birds, they don't know borders and their issues span multiple countries. And because the issues, for instance, that affect migratory birds span multiple countries, you can't just solve it with one country alone. And it requires international cooperation. And because of this, countries have recognized and have come together to address specific issues, right? Like the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands and the Convention on Migratory Species, for instance. So these are examples of international agreements. In the 70s, in the beginning, countries have focused on more specific issues. Like I said, the wetlands or migratory species or trade of endangered species. In the beginning, this was the nature of intergovernmental environmental agreements. After some time, the world recognized the need for more holistic ways to address more of these complex environmental challenges. And in the Earth Summit in 1992, among the key outcomes of this summit was that they developed 3 conventions that are more holistic in nature. And they're called Rio Conventions. And these 3 are the Convention on Biological Diversity, which focuses on biodiversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which focuses on climate change, and the UNCCD, or the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So these were the 3 Rio Conventions that came out in 1992. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Okay. So I'm going to be focusing today on the CBD, to understand for us what it is and what our role is in this convention. So the CBD, as I mentioned, is an international agreement. What it is a consensus among all the countries who have signed on to it, that we need to address biodiversity loss, and it also lays down the actions that we need to do that. It has 3 objectives. Of course, we need to conserve biodiversity. Not only that, we also need to sustainably use biodiversity. So that's the second objective. And aside from that, we also need to share the benefits from biodiversity fairly and equitably. Right? So these are the 3 things. So this third objective is about ensuring, for instance, that because we know that biodiversity is not very equally distributed across the world, and some countries are sources of biodiversity. So it's to make sure that these countries are receiving benefits from biodiversity fairly. Okay. So who is part of the CBD? Probably your country and mine. So almost every single country has signed onto the CBD. And these countries that have ratified or signed the CBD, we call them parties. Okay. And parties basically commit to implementing what the obligations are in the CBD, and I'll get to this in a bit. And they also get to vote on what they discuss, right? So almost every single country except the USA and the Vatican have ratified the CBD. Okay, and this means they have the obligation to implement it. Okay, so why is the CBD important? It represents really countries agreeing to do something about biodiversity loss. It also provides a mandate for the countries and the governments to address biodiversity loss. It gives them a platform to discuss together and collaborate on actions to address biodiversity loss. And it also creates mechanisms so that it's actually implemented on the ground. Okay. And how is this actually implemented? You might be thinking that global policies are quite hard to reach. We don't really know what they mean for us in the country. So what happens is that the CBD, right, which is an agreement, lays down goals and obligations for national governments to implement. So these goals and obligations are things like you need to reduce pollution by this much, you need to protect this much of your area, you need to ensure that agriculture is sustainable, things like this. Those kinds of obligations, the CBD lays them out for national governments, and national governments are required to create a plan for this to happen and implement this plan. So this means like putting it into national legislation or creating conservation initiatives or integrating biodiversity into other sectors. And after a certain period of time, national governments are required to report on their progress back to the CBD. Okay. Again, the CBD lays out goals and obligations for national governments. National governments create plans and implement these plans and then report on their progress back to the CBD. And the main instruments for them to actually plan and implement these obligations are things called national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Every country that has signed the CBD has them. They're called NBSAPs also. And it's a planning instrument that has the specific plan for the for the government of the country on how they will fulfill the objectives of the CBD. And it's one of the legally binding things under the CBD. It's required for every country who has signed it. And again, we also have national reports which have to be submitted by the countries to report on their progress in implementing their NBSAPs. And all of these are actually publicly available. And you are free to look at the NBSAP and the national reports of your countries to see what progress has been made. And yeah, whether it's you're also experiencing, the benefits from implementing this, or if you have been consulted and things like this. So that's how the CBD is implemented. And I'll be talking about a bit about how they make decisions, right? And this is what we're calling the COP. So COP means Conference of the Parties. So we said that parties are the countries who have ratified the CBD. Conference of the Parties means these countries all come together and discuss, right? It's a meeting between countries. So in the CBD, it's the highest decision-making body. It meets every 2 years. And the next one will be the 15th Conference of the Parties happening next year. So that's why it's called COP15. So for the climate change, it's the 26th Conference of the Parties of the UN Convention on Climate Change. So during the COP, which happens every 2 years for the CBD, the countries come together and advance the implementation of the convention through things like decisions and strategic plans. And we'll see what a strategic plan looks like in just a bit. Okay, so this is the previous strategic plan. It was from 2011 to 2020. The strategic plan was for all countries, was to guide all countries in implementing the CBD. It had Aichi targets, 20 of them, with things like this. There are longer text of these things, but things like reducing pollution, reducing invasive species, respecting and conserving traditional knowledge, ensuring we have sustainable fisheries, for instance, ensuring that there's funding for biodiversity. So these are the Aichi targets. And these are what guides also countries to in the creation of their NBSAP, right? Their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. The thing is that none of the Aichi targets have been achieved. We can see that some have been partially achieved, but really none of the 20 Aichi targets that we set in 2011 were fully reached. And why is that? Well, for instance, there has been too much top-down, too little bottom-up action. There has been no significant change in consumption and production patterns. Not enough resources has been mobilized for biodiversity. Profit has been going elsewhere. There has been a gap between what we want to do and also the political will of actually implementing them. We didn't know how to measure our progress very well, and there was just not enough addressing of the underlying drivers. We were only addressing the symptoms of the problem. So that has been the situation with the previous strategic plan. Okay, so I'm just going to take a pause and explain our role in this. You might be wondering why we need to know about this and why we need to get involved. It's because we as children and youth are actually one of the groups that are most vulnerable and most vulnerable to biodiversity loss. We're the most susceptible. We are more susceptible than other groups, for instance, to negative health impacts of pollution and unclean water. We will be living with the long-term consequences of these decisions that are being made on the environment. And more than that, we're also very often not included, not taken seriously, or silenced in terms of decision-making on the environment, not just at the global level, but more so even at the national and local levels, right? But we also have a key role to play. We are already implementing a lot of the biodiversity initiatives, which contribute significantly to a bigger thing, to the global targets that countries have laid out. Whether or not it's being recognized, we are actually on the ground making impact, right? And we are often on the front lines of movements for the environment. And this being said, it means we need to have a voice in decisions that impact us and our future. Okay, so just keep that in mind. as I go further into the CBD. And then later on, we'll see what this actually looks like in practice. Okay, so at the moment, we, as I mentioned, the previous strategic plan ended in 2020. And now countries are coming together to develop the next strategic plan for the next 10 years and even beyond. Currently, we're in the biodiversity super years. World leaders, as I said, are negotiating this strategic plan called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay, so the Global Biodiversity Framework, or sometimes the GBF or the post-2020 GBF, it will define the goals and targets to address biodiversity loss for the next 10 years or even further. Okay, it's being developed under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the aim is that it can improve upon the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. The aim is for it to not just be a framework for governments, but to really be a framework for all sectors, civil society included, youth, women, indigenous peoples and local communities, the private sector, for instance, that it's going to be developed in an inclusive and participatory way, bringing in these diverse voices that I just mentioned, that it's going to create momentum towards concrete and big action towards living in harmony with nature, and that it's going to have similar, targets, goals and targets that are measurable, that are ambitious, and that we can actually implement. Okay, and this is an ongoing process. I'm not going to be able to go too much into this, but this is what it looks like. It currently has 4 goals and 21 targets, similar to the previous one, about things like sustainable consumption and production, about finances, about protected areas, about restoration, ecosystem restoration, protecting species, things like this. Okay, and the goal is for us to achieve the long-term vision of living in harmony with nature. And this whole process is set to be adopted in the next Conference of the Parties, the 15th Conference of the Parties. Part 2 of it is happening next year at around April to May. Okay, so how have youth been participating in this process? So I'm going to talk a bit about the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which I'm a member of. So GIBN is a youth-led global network and we're all collectively working to address biodiversity loss, to do our part in addressing biodiversity loss. But we also play the role of being the international coordination platform for youth participation in the CBD. We represent youth voices in the negotiations, in the international negotiations. Okay. Currently, we have chapters in these places. We have a lot of member organizations also, more than 500 member organizations. And we do empowerment and capacity building, advocacy and campaigning, and mobilization and actions. So, for instance, in this whole post-2020 process, we build capacities of youth so that we know our place and our roles in this whole process. We conduct consultations so that we can represent our community in the best way in the negotiations. We do advocacy, speak to decision makers and key negotiators for them to understand our priorities and bring them into the negotiations. And also we do actions and social online campaigns, for instance, that can amplify our reach. Okay, so these are just some photos of the consultations that we have been conducting and the online campaigns. And this is some photos from our participation in the CBD meetings. We are able to create scholarships for young people to attend these meetings, even online recently in the pandemic, and represent the youth voice and bring our perspective to this space. So this is kind of what it looks like, and this is a big part of what we do. So our goal in participating in this whole thing is that we want to contribute our voice so that the post-2020 framework, which is under development, can actually reflect the priorities of global youth, and that it's going to be a transformative framework that can really address the root causes of biodiversity loss. Just to summarize a bit of what we've been advocating for in these spaces, we envision a future that prioritizes the integrity of our life support systems over profit. We have diverse societies living sustainably, and that we have equity for nature and people. And we have been advocating for specific priorities for young people, like intergenerational equity or like fairness between generations, the full and effective participation of youth. We need to be heard in these decision-making spaces. Transformative education is another big priority for youth. We believe education has a key role in addressing those root causes, those indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And we need rights-based approaches for people and nature, because conservation activities shouldn't violate human rights, but should instead help to promote them. Okay, so just last few slides, what I do want to leave with you here is that we as children and youth, again, are among the most heavily impacted by biodiversity loss, but we are also key implementers on the ground, contributing to global targets, and we need to be able to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect us. And we are also really a very creative force. We are a source of innovation. And throughout history, we have been part of catalyzing important changes in society that lead to kind of a better future for us and others in our generation and future generations. And so what I want to say is that really our voices and our actions matter, and they play a big part in this whole thing, no matter how sometimes you don't realize it because it's political or it's kind of high up or high level, but we can kind of participate and bring our voices to these processes. This is an invitation to join our community. Again, we participate in the CBD meetings, and also come together to implement many different projects. You're very welcome to join, and that's it. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Josefa, for your great presentations, and it's really detailed and give us a really good understanding about some of the history of the CBD, how CBDs work, and how it's linked with the national policies like NBSAPs, and especially how youth can be engaged in the these processes of decision makings. So now we have the Q&A sections, and don't be shy to raise your hands and speak up. So I actually saw a question from Yunju. There's one question about when national governments submit national reports to the CBD, then it is shown that the CBD provides goals and obligations to the governments. Is it legally binding? And if the government breaks the obligation, do they get a specific limitations or will be fined?
Thank you, Yunju, for that. So I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this, but as I understand it, they are a form of soft law, but and NBSAPs and national reports are definitely some of the things that are required and implemented in the CBD. The challenge is actually creating stronger implementation and accountability mechanisms so that we can ensure that they are being implemented. And it's also a big role for us as civil society to hold our governments accountable so that they implement their actions. So for instance, in the post-2020 framework, we are also trying to push for stronger accountability mechanisms and ensure that these don't just these aren't just left to plans or reports, and that they're actually implemented. What this would look like, I can't really explain in detail. I'm sorry. But yes, these are the NBSAPs and the national reports are the key implementation mechanisms. There are others, for instance, having individual countries present their reports and doing peer review of these reports. Those are other mechanisms being looked into. There are, for instance, commitments by countries and that they can make beyond what they write down in their NBSAPs, things like this. But similar to other conventions, I think it's legally binding only if they make that jump to actually put it into their national legislation and make it legally binding in their own countries.
Yes, thank you, Safra. That's a good answer because it's also implemented to other convention like the Ramsar Convention that EAFP is one of the initiative is, and it's really depending on how strong the government's willingness to implement this convention agreed policies into their national legislation and policy. So yeah, and relating to these questions, you mentioned about why there is a failure for achieving all the IT targets. One may be because of the little bottom-up actions, and there may be lack of measurements of these targets. So it's kind of like linking to civil societies, because the CBD, like how to implement these IG targets, is not only the responsibility of the government, is also down to the earth, down to the ground for all the civil society to support it. So from your viewpoints, how would you see young people working in local aspects, how can they be involved into this bottom-up actions?
Yeah, I think we are definitely, as I said already, doing very significant things on the ground. These are all very valuable and they need to be supported much more than they already are by governments and also other actors. So we're also, for instance, this is kind of a bit of why policy matters. If, for instance, the post-2020 framework puts into its indicators measurements for how for youth initiatives or for indigenous peoples initiatives, then they can kind of count towards these global targets. If we ensure that our voice is being heard in the post-2020 framework, then we can have policies that call for greater support for these on-the-ground initiatives, greater, not just financial support and also other participatory mechanisms, for instance. And we can also have a say in how these targets are being measured and ensure that those indicators are actually, meaningful for us, that they count, what we are doing as being as contributing to the achievement of these global targets, if it's really going to be a framework for all, right? Another thing is that, like, for instance, these having a say in this process makes us ensure also that the impacts on us are being counted. If you disaggregate data, for instance, by age or by gender, you know how we as youth are being impacted differently from others, or things like this.
Great, thank you, Safa. Yes, also it's related to what Sarah has mentioned. It's actually related to the behavioral change. It can be consumption, it can be about how we behave in our daily lives. It can start with small changes in locally. So and also related to what you said, and we also have to make our actions accountable. So people will rely on what the consistent action from the youth to make ourselves also reliable and make us to be heard by and trustful to the society as well. Right, so I think we have covered the questions, and yeah, because we're kind of running out of time, we still have a little section about the briefing for the think tank competition before we end this section. So thank you again, Safa. And if you have any more questions after this webinar, you can also email to us through the Flyway Youth Forum at gmail.com. And yeah, Safa, maybe can I invite you to leave them the link for the given link to the chat group so that people can have a look. And now I would like to share the to briefly talk about the think tank competition. So let me go through this again, and I think now is okay, right? Okay, perfect. So yeah, this is one of the first workshop for the youth think tank competition, and now I'm going to talk more about this whole program. For this is following the momentum from the last year Flyway Youth Forum 2022, we hear that young people are longing or eager to take action, but they are also looking for good platforms and resources. And that's why we have launched the Youth Think Tank competition in September and looking for young people to make more changes to our society. And this program is divided into two parts. The first part is the think tank competition itself. And we wanted to motivate young people in the EAA Flyway who are keen to contribute for the conservation of migratory water birds and the habitats. And we're focusing on three aspects: the science, society, and SIPA, which stand for communication, education, participation, and awareness. We also, in line with the competition, we have a part 2, which is the training workshop, and that is what we are doing now. We have the first workshop, which we have today, and followed up by 2 other workshops in 2022. We will also have to focus on the topics on practical implementation initiatives, local community engagement, and third workshop will be about communication, like storytelling and scientific communications. And all these 3 workshops will also have one section about project management. So today we are going to have an in-depth workshop. Tomorrow we are going to have in-depth workshop on project planning and proposal writing. And then next year we'll cover project management and fundraising. And the last one will be on the project evaluation and impact measurements. So going back to part 1, the think tank competition, we are recruiting proposals and projects that have elements related to the migratory water birds within the EAA Flyway. So I'll have to stress that's because the EAFP have the mission just focusing on the East Asian Australasian Flyway. So proposal have to be focusing on this region. And for the, as I mentioned, we are focusing on the science, society, and SIPA. We are targeting the young conservationists as our prioritized participations for this competition. Green youth groups, local and international NGOs, young staffs, and university students. So they have to be aged between 18 to 29. And the formats, we have phase 1. Phase 1 will be proposal submission. You also have to prepare the proposal through our online platform and a 3 minutes video pitch. We also have a judge panel review by the end of December this year, which we will select 5 finalist teams. and they will be awarded a small grant fund to implement the projects for at least 3 to 10 months. And we are going to have the open online presentation pitching and open forum Q&A at the end of next year, 2022. And we will have the winning team selection by the end of next year. So regarding the timeline, we started to call for proposal from since 17th of September, and the deadline of the submission will be 17th of November. This, it's coming to be this month. And after that, we will have the judging in from the 1st to the 15th of December, and we will announce the announcement for the 5 projects selected for the phase 1 between 21st of to the 24th of December. And we will have about 10 months for the implementation of these 5 selected projects. And then we will have the final voting and judging in October 2022 and announce the overall champion for this competition in October or November 2022. So for the prize, the 5 finalists group, they are going to have award of $3,000 each. In accompanying that each of these 5 projects, they will be assigned with a mentor to coach them along the implementation of the projects. And then we will have the phase 2 to select the overall winner from this 5 finalist award to become the EAFP Youth Ambassador. And they may also grant an opportunity to attend EAFP or an international event, which amount for the US dollars $5,000. But because of the COVID, this is also subject to the opportunity and the restriction of traveling. And talking more a little bit about the eligibility. So for, as I mentioned, all the team members has to be youth, which we defined as between the age of 18 to under 30, so 18 to 29. And the nationality has to be within the EAA Flyway. However, we also encourage collaboration with other flyways. So we are encouraging people to team up with people from the other flyways for the projects. But the number of people, they has to be like less than half of the team members for the application. So yeah, so please check this up. You can team up with people from other flyways, but the number cannot exceed half of the number of the team members from the EAA Flyway. And you can team up to a maximum 5 people. And all them team members have to be early career conservationists and cannot have more than 5 years of working experience in this field. And university students are also eligible. Regarding the projects, as mentioned, the EAFP mission is mainly focusing on the East Asian Australasian Flyway. So the projects will be selected will also have to be those within this flyway. And all the projects also need to be to include CPR elements. So if you are focusing on the science, on the research of migratory waterbirds and wetlands, you also have to think about how you bring the results of your projects out to the society and the public through the CPR activities. Or maybe you can think about the CPR products like producing some leaflets or some online materials for sharing to the others. And the implementation of the projects has to be between January and October to 2022. And it has to be more than 3 months and no more than 10 months. And all the project implementation has to follow the regulations and law of the nations to where the project is implemented. So yeah, you may be from different countries in the flyway. So there is no uniform, like no single rule. So you have to follow the law from your countries. and only one project should be submitted from each team. This project cannot be part of an existing or continuing a past project or study. And the project may not be receiving other financial support, but we also encourage fundraising during the implementation of your projects. The proposal has to be written by the applicants and has to be in English. The incomplete application will not be eligible. And lastly, the awarded applicants for phase 1 has to use the grants, the $3,000 for the implementation of the project only. So that is the end of my presentation, and thank you all for your participation, and please keep and follow the EAA FB through our social media and our websites. And I would like to see if there is any other questions from the audience regarding the think tank competition, then please raise, and you can unmute yourself and raise this now. If I can advise, maybe Sewon or Hyun can share the link of the think tank competition to this chat box. Thank you. Okay, seems like all are clear with what we are talking. So please refer to the link that we have for the think tank competition, and you can also search it from our website. So please help to help to share the news to the others. Okay. Okay, I'm sharing it now. All right. So for people who are joining the in-depth workshop today, don't forget that we are going to meet in about 1.5 hours later. And thank you very much for all your attention for this 1 hour and 45 minutes. Thank you, Sefa, for your wonderful speech, and Sewon, Hyun, and Yunju for your facilitation. Thank you very much, and see you all again for our second workshops. Bye.